And next slide, please. Are you able to advance? Thanks. Well, welcome everyone to TIEEN's collaborative webinar on legislative and regulatory developments in Texas impacting energy production, efficiency, and use. The recent Texas legislative session included several bills with significant potential impacts on both development of renewables and energy efficiency. In addition, operators are getting mixed signals from federal and state governments. This makes it difficult to manage their operations and especially difficult to plan for new projects. We have experts and market participants with us today to share their insights as we grapple with this challenging topic. So hello, everyone. I'm Alan Rossiter. I'm with UH Energy at the University of Houston, and it's my privilege to be the coordinator for the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Network, or TIEEN. Next slide, please.
That was the first project, super good.
So some housekeeping points, and the first one is please stay muted and keep your video off. So please could you stay muted and keep your video off unless you're a presenter. If you'd like to see the speaker bios and webinar details, the link is on the screen, and I just also put it in the chat. And also for Q&A, please note during the panel discussion, we will be accepting Q&A, and please just use the regular chat box to post your questions, and we will try to deal with them when we can during the panel discussion. Also, some of you I know would like PDH certificates, professional development certificates, especially those of you who are professional engineers. And we do have a mechanism for providing those, which will be made available at the end of the webinar. Also, we will have a survey, and we'd like, if you could complete that survey too at the end, and well, we'll give you the instructions for that right at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. Some of you may be wondering what the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Network, or TIEEN, is. Well, it is a network of publicly supported industrial energy efficiency organizations. TIEEN is funded through a grant from the State Energy Conservation Office, or SECO, and it is operated through UH Energy at the University of Houston. What I'd like to do now is to introduce the other members of the TIEEN network, the representatives from each of these organizations. So next slide, please. First of all, Liz from SPEAR.
Yes, thank you, Alan. Hi, everyone. Liz John with SPEAR. I am the managing director. And I was just going to provide a quick background of what SPEAR is. And we are a regional energy efficiency organization, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit. Our territory is Texas and Oklahoma, and our mission is to accelerate the adoption of energy efficient products and services. We do this through a number of program areas, which I'll discuss on the next slide. Our members and diverse allies and partnerships include utilities, state and local governments, implementers, retail electric providers, and academics, to name a few. And a lot of our work involves educating legislative staff and promoting policies that advance energy efficiency, technology, and research. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So, living in Texas, we know that the primary driver of Texas peak demand is residential heating and cooling, and buildings contribute almost 30% of global emissions each year. Because peak demand has risen in ERCOT's region by 45% since the year 2000, we know that energy efficiency and demand response can mitigate a lot of this demand that we are experiencing. So as the regional leader of education and promotion for energy efficient building systems, while also focusing on distributed energy resources, We work in areas for energy code adoption. We work closely with local governments for energy reporting and climate action. We have a heat pump working group, and we do a number of trainings for building technology and code enforcement. That's a quick overview. We do a lot more than that, but thank you, Alan, for giving us a few minutes to introduce SPEAR.
Thank you so much, Liz. Much appreciated. Kurt, you're up next with TMAC. Oh, yeah.
So good afternoon. My name is Kurt Middlecoop. I'm with TMAC. So NIST, the federal government, has a program called Manufacturing Extension Partnership, and TMAC is the affiliate for the state of Texas. And our mission is to accelerate profitable growth, specifically for the Texas manufacturers. And we're looking at basically any best practice that can help these manufacturers to be more profitable by specifically looking at processes, best practices for technology, and also how to develop the people. So we are about keeping manufacturing strong across the state of Texas. Recently, we received funding from a pollution prevention grant. So part of our mission for TMAC is also to promote best practices from the DOE. So we help with energy studies for manufacturers, energy best practices. We also help promote LEED green building best practices, and also the best practices from pollution prevention through the US EPA. And our recent grant is using sensors to collect data for various waste reductions that we're trying to do for either water, heating and cooling savings, to help document the before and after. So we're excited to be able to partner with all these agencies. And if you have any questions, if you're a manufacturer and you're wanting someone to come by to have a second look at your facility, just a walk through, you can call us. We have 7 centers across the state, and somebody would be glad to come by and visit you. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the conference this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Kurt. Next up is Carlos.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Gamarra. I'm the Director of Clean Energy here at HARC. And HARC is the Houston Advanced Research Center. We are a nonprofit research organization based in the Woodlands. Our work, we focus on the sustainability. Most of our work navigates around flows. I mean, it's around sustainability. And we try to apply science to drive energy, air and water, and resilient solutions, supporting all kinds of entities on the adoption of more sustainable, more advanced technologies, but also practices. We have 5 program areas, as you can see in this slide: energy, air, water, climate, and geospatial. And I invite everyone to check our website for additional details. And I think, Alan, my contact information is in the next slide.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Very good. And also there's some information in the chat as well for you. Okay, next slide, please. And this is the introduction for the IAC program at Texas A&M University. Jim Egerbrecht, who is the rep from the IAC within our TIEEN organization, is dealing with some family issues today. But I will just give you a brief overview of his area. The IAC, or Industrial Assessment Center, is a program through the Department of Energy. And through this program, it essentially is focusing on small to medium-sized companies and providing services to them, especially in the area of energy efficiency. And it has some expansions beyond just pure energy efficiency. But essentially, it deals with organizations with sites that are less than 500 employees and annual sales less than 100 million, energy costs between 100,000 and 3.5 million, with no on-site energy manager. And for facilities like that, the IAC will provide a no-cost energy conservation study, quantify savings and implementation costs. And this will be facilitated by professional staff from the IAC Center, assisted by 4 to 6 students. So this is a great win-win in that it provides opportunities to provide an energy efficiency study for your facility while also providing education to the students. And there have been some great results coming out of these. Jim's contact information is in the chat, also on the screen. So if you would like to contact him, there's the information. Next slide, please. So last but not least, we have PACE, and this will be Doug Taylor.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so PACE is a financing program enabled by the state legislature in Texas a decade ago. This helps answers the question of how to pay for it. A lot of times there are great projects, energy and water conservation and distributed generation projects that would benefit plant operations and manufacturers, but there's limited capital to implement those with internal funds. So PACE is a financing program that can be accessed to move those projects forward. Slide.
Doug, you're muted. Oh, okay.
Oh, is the next slide up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, next slide. Doug, thanks.
Yeah, so our organization, Texas PACE Authority, is a nonprofit, a C3 like SPEAR. We administer PACE programs for now 93 cities and counties around the state that have set them up. About 450 million invested statewide through the PACE mechanism. These projects involve energy efficiency, water conservation, and distributed generation. This is an equipment financing program that has that allows for very long-term financing, so that the benefits from the project meet the financing cost. This makes the projects budget neutral, and 100% private financing is used to facilitate the projects. And the key to this is secured through a property assessment on the project that serves as security. Next slide. And examples: if the project can reduce energy or water usage, or generate power or thermal energy on site, then it's something that could potentially qualify for PACE. In the industrial space, a whole host of energy and water savings projects that you typically see, and upgrades and turnarounds can be PACE financed. The key to this, the graph on the right, is that they are designed to be cash positive. For one, they increase the value of the property and generate cash flow immediately for the owner. Again, a fairly new option, although 10 years established in the state of Texas, and being used more and more in the industrial and manufacturing space now. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Doug. Much appreciated. All right. Well, next up, it is my great pleasure to introduce Doug Lewin. Doug is very well known in the energy space here in Texas. He is the founder of Stoic Energy and also executive director of the Texas Energy Summit, which I hope many of you will be going to. It's coming up fairly soon. Also, he has a long history in this energy field. And interestingly enough, he was the founding executive director of SPEAR. So we have some connections there with one of our TIEEN member organizations. And also in his earlier years, he was a legislative aide for 5 years, which gives him a great starting position in this whole area of reviewing legislative issues. So without further ado, Doug, I will hand over to you. And I should just mention at this point, sorry, Doug, if I can just hold you one moment. Those of you who are expecting to see Pablo Pinto at this point as our moderator, something came up, and for reasons beyond his control, which he has had to drop out at the last minute. So Doug has stepped up, and he is taking over the moderator slot. So again, our best wishes to Pablo, not able to be here, and Doug, many thanks to you again for stepping up to take this on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Sorry, Pablo couldn't be with us today, and I'll run through his slides in just a minute. Thanks for the introduction, Alan. I should just let everybody know we do plan to leave some time for questions from the audience at the end. So if you want to put those in the chat as we go, the folks from the University of Houston will monitor those, and we will leave some time at the end. I'm going to go through Pablo's slides in my own, and then I'll introduce Kay and Jack, the other two speakers on this. And as Alan said, I'll be moderator slash speaker, like the old days in baseball when they were player slash coaches. I'm gonna do both. So I might ask myself a question. No, I won't really do that. I'm just kidding. But anyway, this is great. It's great to see so many folks online. Many of you I know and have worked with over the years, and some are new. Looking forward to connecting with y'all afterwards. As Alan said, I'm the director of the Texas Energy Summit. That is coming up November 15th, 16th at the Capitol. I dropped a link, though it doesn't look like it's hot link, but texasenergysummit.com. I also write the Texas Energy and Power newsletter, which you can find at douglewin.com. So I'll go through Pablo's slides here. Can we go ahead and advance the slide? And I think, he wanted to just sort of set the table for this discussion with a little bit of what happened during the 88th session, which was the 2023 session. Of course, there's a third special session going on right now, but that special session, at least at the moment, I don't think anybody expects this to change anytime soon, doesn't have any energy issues on it. But the regular session had quite a bit of energy, as you might imagine, as did the 87th. Following Winter Storm Uri and sort of ongoing issues flowing from that and other issues as well. So as Pablo had on this slide, the legislative intent, obviously trying to make the system more reliable, but also more resilient to these sort of increasing frequency and magnitude extreme events. A few different ways they were looking at that, and we got a couple other slides that'll dive into this a little bit more as far as what they were, but trying to get more dispatchable power generation in, looking at demand response and even energy efficiency. Energy storage certainly came up during the session. So we can go to the next slide and talk about a couple of the bills that got quite a bit of attention and headlines during the session. The Senate Bill 6 did not pass. Actually, nor did Senate Bill 7. Parts of Senate Bill 7 made it into a different bill called House Bill 1500, which we can talk about as we get into the discussion. But Senate Bill 6 would have put $10 billion towards state procured power plants that basically would have never run except in an emergency when there wasn't enough capacity. This is often sort of euphemistically referred to as the Berkshire Hathaway bill, because Berkshire Hathaway was the one who first brought this to the legislature in 2021. It did not, of course, pass in 2021, but was sort of brought back in 2023. It passed the Senate. It never had a hearing in the House. The Senate Bill 7 was a wide-ranging bill. I think and I'm not going to say too much about this, I know Kay is going to talk about it, but there was a lot of emphasis on trying to add cost to renewable energy that was part of that bill. Very controversial. And again, we'll dive into that. So I'll just leave that for the moment, but just know we will talk about that more. Senate Bill 2627, this one was particularly interesting. This one did pass along with HJR 93, which means that each and every one of you, assuming you are Texans, will be able to vote on this on November 7th. You will need to decide whether or not you're going to vote yay or nay on spending $10 billion for a couple different things. The bulk of it, about 80% of that $10 billion, would go towards a bonus, a grant for thermal power plants, and for 3% interest loans. The 3% interest loan part is particularly interesting given we're in an 8% interest rate environment, or maybe it's a little less for power projects, but somewhere in that range, right? It could be a little less, a little more, but somewhere around 8%. You're not getting 3% money these days, unless you go to the PUC, which will now become a bank and need to assess credit risk. So that's going to be really interesting. If it passes, widely expected to pass, very, very rare that constitutional amendments don't pass. There are other aspects of that. And again, we'll talk about some of that as we get into the discussion. But there's one other piece I'll mention there is the backup. I think they call it the backup power promise or something like that. But there's 1.8 billion of the 10 billion is to go to microgrids up to 2.5 megawatts. It's about $1 million, to be about $1.2 million for a 2.5 megawatt system for critical facilities. So fire stations, police stations, hospitals, water treatment facilities, anything that is deemed to be critical. would be eligible for a pretty large grant. And I think this is that piece of it is actually one of the most consequential things, in my view anyway, that the legislature has done to increase reliability post-Uri. We can talk about that more. There's one more slide with a couple of bills. It was great to hear from Texas Space Authority, Keep Basing Texas, and SPEAR. Energy efficiency is something they both work on a lot, as of course we're on the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Network. So obviously something near and dear to this group itself. Senate Bill 258 actually passed the Senate and would have increased the state's energy efficiency goals by about 5x. I know it says on here shift from 0.4% of peak to 1%, but actually the bill was 1% of sales. And as far as how it's measured in sales as opposed to peak demand, it's about 0.2% right now. So it would have been a really large increase in energy efficiency. Would have given until 2030 to get there. And mind you, that 1% would have put us right in the middle of the pack of states that have goals. We would have merely been average. We are right now dead last of the 27 states that have an energy efficiency goal with our 0.4% peak or 0.2% sales. That did pass the Senate. Unfortunately, it did not pass in the House. It had a hearing, but did not get advanced through committee. And that is, and again, I'm going to talk about that I'm giving Pablo's talk now. I'm going to give my own talk in a minute, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm a little over time, so I'll just say real quick about 1287. This bill also did not pass. It passed the Senate, not the House, but important provisions of this did get into HB 1500. There is a rulemaking underway right now at the commission. As a matter of fact, comments closed last Friday, and they are trying to figure out how to assign some cost of transmission to generators that site far away from transmission. So that is going to be absolutely worth keeping an eye on as it goes forward. At 1287, to be clear, they didn't just take that bill and put it into 1500. It was a very different version of it that made it into that bill, but at least the key elements of it were there. So I'm going to transition now from talking about the legislature, talking about what I viewed as some of the most important pieces during the session, which were energy efficiency and demand side. So if you go ahead and advance the slide. And this is a theme I often speak about. It is very important to me, and I hope is important to you too. And I think there was actually an ERCOT board meeting today. There was a lot of discussion about affordability. I think right after Uri, the discussion kind of became reliability and basically sort of reliability at any cost. In my view, anyway, that pendulum is swinging back, and there's a little bit more balance between reliability and affordability. I think also sustainability is an absolutely critical element. And we have to recognize that certain forms of power do have massive health effects, not equitably across our population, but massive health effects. And so that sustainability piece is absolutely critical. And these things all go together. The reason I sort of talk about this as a puzzle is because anytime I give a talk, no matter how much time, and I'm just supposed to talk for the next 5 minutes or even a little bit less, since I'm over a little bit, there's no way I could talk about all of it. I want to make sure everybody understands that I am not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that energy efficiency or demand response or anything I'm going to talk about would solve all of our problems, but they are key pieces. And Kay and Jack are going to talk about some of those other pieces. It is critical that we do a lot of things right now. So let's go ahead and advance the slide. I want everybody just to look at this for a second. So whatever you're doing, if you were looking away, take a second, look at the screen. And I'm going to give you this challenge. Here's your challenge. You need to make this grid pattern symmetrical using the fewest clicks possible. If you click a white square, it's going to turn green. If you click a green square, it's going to turn white. How do you make this balance and be symmetrical top to bottom and right to left? Just think about it for a minute. Go ahead and click once more for me. So this comes from an experiment, sort of a social science experiment done by some researchers at the University of Virginia. They published their findings in the journal Nature, and then they wrote an article about it in Harvard Business Review called When Subtraction Adds Value. Go ahead and click one more slide, please, one more button, rather. Yeah, so, and here's the upshot of this. If you said, I would click 4 green squares, congratulations, you are in a very small minority, typically about 20 to 30% of people that figure out that to make it symmetrical, they could just click 4 times. A vast majority of people click 12 times. They click on each of those other 3 quadrants to make it symmetrical. And what the researchers write about is we see this manifest in a number of different ways in human life. We as human beings we seem to be biased towards additive solutions. We think when there's a problem that we need to add something, when in fact, subtraction can often be a better solution. And I think this is just a perfect parallel for what's going on with our grid. And I think it's funny, actually, that this is referred to, right, as a grid. They're showing you a grid. Could we take away something and achieve the same result? So if you'd advance to the next slide, there was a study done by the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy that looked at how much power we could remove from the grid as far as demand. Because if you're the grid operator, you're ERCOT, and you're in Winter Storm Uri, and you have two major problems here. You don't have enough supply, right? And you have way too much demand. So there's two sides of that coin, right? And most of the efforts of the legislature and the Public Utility Commission and ERCOT have been focused on getting more supply. And that's not bad. There is more supply that is needed, but they're often neglected is that demand side. And if you can bring down demand, you are equally, or in some cases, even better, in better ways, solving that problem. The Wall Street Journal took from that American Council for Energy Efficient Economy and showed that not easily, this is challenging, but Texas could achieve 10 gigawatts worth of reductions. And I thought the Wall Street Journal put it very well in calling this an obvious, affordable fix for Texas electricity problems. It's obvious, it's affordable, but it has not been implemented. Texas has not, as we just talked about, increased energy efficiency. That bill failed during the session. The PUC does have the authority to increase energy efficiency goals on its own. It did so in 2010. There's recent precedent, but the PUC to this point has not chosen to take that step. I'm just going to show one more slide before I introduce Kay and we move on with the discussion. And what this slide shows is the difference in cost to subtract 10 gigawatts versus adding 10 gigawatts. So I just said you're going to vote on a very expensive, right? Texas has allocated already in the budget last year $5 billion, and the plan is to put another $5 billion in the next biennium. So it's actually the cost to get 10 gigawatts is a little bit more than 10 billion. This shows 10.5 billion. It's because of supply chain problems and inflation. It's almost certainly much higher than that now. We're going to get a new study out of ERCOT pretty soon that will make an estimate of this. And I would bet anybody on this call $20 right now. It's going to be much higher in the next estimate. But let's take this conservative estimate of $10.5 billion for 10 gigawatts of new natural gas plants. If we were to focus on inefficient heat in poorly insulated homes with energy efficiency over the same period of time to 2030, it would cost $500 million to remove 10 gigawatts. So again, subtraction can be additive, right? Subtraction can actually help solve our problems. I'll leave you with this before I introduce Kay and turn it over to her. In those same experiments, when the University of Virginia researchers said to the subject, when they showed them that grid, if they said to them, you can add or subtract to solve this puzzle, a majority of people clicked just 4 times to remove the square. So when prompted, people often make the right choice, but in the absence of that prompt, they will almost always add. All right, so let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce Kay, who's going to talk about, this is my contact information. There's my email, the Energy and Power newsletter that I mentioned earlier, a couple other places you can find me, in that link to the Texas Energy Summit website. But go ahead and click once more. Let's go to Kay. So probably many of you, particularly in Houston, know Kay. She is a force. She does fantastic work with the Renewable Energy Alliance Houston. She has been working on these issues for a long time, including a stint on the senior leadership team at GE Oil and Gas. She's held many different leadership positions at companies over the years, including CEO of a renewable energy company. She has 2 different degrees from the University of Houston, so she feels right at home with all this red on the slides right here. And I'm excited to hear from Kay. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. I think we've got another slide coming up. There we go. I have to give a little plug here for the Renewable Energy Alliance of Houston. which is a nonprofit. If you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Nonprofit trade association in Houston. We were launched back in 2020 during the pandemic to basically draw attention to the fact that Houston is all energy, not just oil and gas, but also renewable energy. And we've been working since then to expand the community, provide some thought leadership and connection. But we don't take policy positions and we don't lobby. So all of these opinions, of which I will always have an opinion, these are my own. So don't blame anybody else for them. They're mine. All right, next. So this is my moment to give a little bit of perspective. And what I wanted to do was just give a couple of moments to remind people who knew and perhaps some that didn't of how Texas became the renewable energy capital that it is. Really began in the early 2000s. At that time, George Bush was pro wind energy. And basically, it was something that grew in Texas as a hedge against what was then $10 and $12 natural gas. And utilities were the first buyers, and they're what really, it was always economic. Nobody talked about climate change in Texas back then. And that's really where it all started in Texas. Over time, the environment changed, the conversations changed, but the wind continued to blow and wind continued to be built because developers developed. Solar came in and is now growing faster than wind. But it still, there's a lot to talk about with economics, with renewable energy. It's been estimated that last year, Texas consumers were saved $11 billion in electricity costs, something that's rarely talked about, but in the power industry, but will be at some point, is water scarcity. And for my fellow landowners in Texas, we take our water very seriously. I own some property out in Austin County. I consider that water to be very dear. Wind energy doesn't use any. Solar uses very little. But we've saved billions of gallons of water that we would have had to withdraw and consume by having renewable energy. Meanwhile, another thing I want to mention is, of course, the shale revolution brought cheaper gas, but what it also brought was an interest in exporting natural gas versus importing. 20 years ago, when we talked about LNG, we were going to import LNG into Texas. Now we talk about exporting it. Now what we're starting to see for the first time in Texas, our natural gas prices have always based on our internal fundamentals. We're seeing a disconnect between the internal fundamentals on natural gas prices and the actual gas prices, which are now beginning to have a loose correlation with global natural gas prices, which is to say that, again, my opinion, $2 natural gas, no one's going to export natural gas because they want $2 for it. So I would expect that there is quite the possibility that natural gas prices are going to increase over the number of years. Meanwhile, there are also reasonable people who are estimating that in Texas, we will see a 2 to 3x increase in demand for electricity and power in the next 20 years. And I hope I'm so glad Doug's talking about efficiency and demand response, et cetera, because that's going to be incredibly important it's important now. It will be important in the future, but we have to be smart and plan for the projected growth in demand. But despite all that, and the fact that we need all energy in Texas, the renewable energy industry faced really an unprecedented amount of anti-renewable legislation in this last session, including legislation that was aimed at existing generation, not just curbing the growth of it in the future, but actually potentially taking some of our generation that we have offline. And I would think as in Texas, we don't want to see that happen. But anyway, we'll talk further about some of the implications. But there we go. That's my perspective, part of my perspective. Doug?
Thanks, Kate. We'll get more of your perspective as we get into the discussion here. Appreciate that very much. I'm now going to go ahead and introduce Jack Belcher. He's a principal at Cornerstone Government Affairs and is also founder and vice president of the Center for ESG and Sustainability. 30 years experience in this space, has done a lot of things over his career, including being regulatory affairs manager at Shell America's Exploration Production, a staff director at the U.S. House Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources, so experience both in government and industry, policy and communications. Very excited to hear Jack's perspective on a number of different issues related to reliability and hydrogen, a few other interesting things. So Jack, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll get into discussion after your remarks.
Great. Well, thank you, Doug. It's good to be here. A little bit about Cornerstone. We're a government relations firm. We also do public affairs. We consult on ESG and sustainability. The company's based in Washington, D.C., but we have offices around the country in different states, 13 states, and including an office in Houston and one in Austin. And we do lobby. So we a big part of what we do is lobbying on some of these issues. So go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are and what some of the shortcomings are in terms of reliability as we get through this session and we look forward at what was accomplished. Some of the fundamental things really that we don't have, the mechanisms that are in place are not going to pay for generation. They may be able to pay for additional facilities, but they're not. We don't have a capacity payment in place in Texas, and we aren't going to have one into the foreseeable future. A lot of people think that's a problem. Others argue that we don't want to have that in Texas, but that situation is not changing. So the fundamental problems are still there. We've had thermal capacity decreasing over time, and we don't have enough baseload generation capacity in place currently, as we've looked at some of these weather events and our ability to meet demand. And we were very lucky this year in the summer that we didn't have a worse situation. And I think ERCOT did kind of an amazing job at times, keeping us out of rolling blackouts. As Liz mentioned earlier, we've got really serious demand growth. That's coming from an increase in our population, in our robust economy here in Texas. But we also have some of the energy hogs coming into place, the data centers and the cryptocurrency, which are putting additional strains on the system because of increased demand. There's also concern about our intrastate pipeline system in Texas. A lot of our gas moves through that system, and there is no requirement to put out volumes. There's no transparency in terms of what's out there, and that has an impact because it's hard to know how much gas is available for generation. Storage is encouraging. We've got new storage capacity coming on in the next over the next year or so, and that's going to be very helpful in terms of renewable energy supplies, being able to store some of that power and dispatch it when it's needed. But there is uncertainty about how that's going to impact the grid. As I was talking with the PUC about this, they just don't know. I mean, it may be a smooth transition. There may be some technical issues along the way, but we are moving in that direction. One of the issues that's come up both in terms of Texas and really happening around the world is increased interest in nuclear as a nuclear energy. The governor has put out the Texas Advanced Nuclear Reactor Working Group, and this is looking at some of the advanced technologies out there, like small modular reactors. These reactors could be used in conjunction with industrial processes where you're using localized power and then putting additional electrons onto the grid. This task force, which is going to be headed up, or which is being headed up by PUC Commissioner Jimmy Glockelty, is going to be, looking at some of the regulatory issues in place, ways to streamline permitting. And there are also supply chain issues out there that are impacting nuclear. So I think this is a very interesting development and something that's sort of in line with things that are happening in different parts of the world. Next slide. So I also want to talk about some of the things that are taking place, from the federal perspective, but that have provide opportunities in Texas. One of those being the Inflation Reduction Act. It's really interesting because I work with companies that operate around the world, and I do a lot of communication with companies that are either, based in Europe or operate in Europe, and the European perspective has been that the Inflation Reduction Act is a real big game changer in terms of the U.S. putting money into decarbonization. A lot of them feel that we're passing Europe because all of this money is available. So it's very interesting to hear that perspective, and it's even causing companies over there. It's also along with high energy prices to locate, industrial activity in the U.S. and open facilities over here. So we're talking about $783 billion in climate-related funding that were part of the IRA. And so some of that's going into things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen. One of the impacts is a methane fee that is going to be encouraging leak detection and mitigation in terms of methane. A lot of programs out there that affect things like industrial decarbonization, energy efficiency. So we're talking about loans, grants, and technical assistance that are going to be made available through the DOE. So there are a lot of opportunities. It's a lot of money that's going to be distributed. There's a lot of complexity in all of this. It's putting a lot of strain on DOE and some of the other federal agencies involved. They have not traditionally been a bank, and so there are a lot of challenges for them getting the money out there, staffing challenges, getting the guidance out to the different programs has been taking time, and a lot of interagency coordination that needs to take place and has been difficult to do. And then there are stipulations with the money that comes out for these projects. Some of those stipulations are difficult in terms of apprenticeship programs and things that are required. So it's been interesting. This does a lot for the state of Texas, especially when you think about all the carbon capture and storage projects, for instance. Hydrogen, I'm going to talk a little bit about industrial decarbonization. A lot of opportunity in Texas, but it's been a bit tricky in Texas because there hasn't been the kind of support for these programs. A lot of folks in Texas opposed the bill when it came out, and we've got this anti-ESG movement, and in some cases, as was discussed earlier by Kay, there's been a kind of an anti-renewable movement as well. So this has all been kind of difficult. I encourage people to, encourage your lawmakers to really push for some of these funds to be, released in Texas, and because I think there are a lot of big opportunities for us to use the money here in the state of Texas. If we could go to the next slide. One of the areas I think that's quite significant is the hydrogen hub. Just this last Friday, the Department of Energy announced that there'll be $7 billion in funding that's going out to launch 7 regional hydrogen hubs. This funding actually came through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which preceded the Inflation Reduction Act. But we're looking at significant amounts of hydrogen that are should be produced from the money that's being funded here. One of those hubs is going to be here in the Houston area, the Gulf Coast Hydrogen Hub, or the High Velocity Hub. And we're talking about $1.2 billion in grants, a lot of impact in terms of local jobs, construction, and then permanent jobs. And what this hub is going to do is going to be producing blue hydrogen from using natural gas and using carbon capture and storage to bring down the carbon content, and then also green hydrogen using renewables to generate the electricity to produce the hydrogen. So two different pathways that I think are both going to be very important as we look at opportunities in terms of hydrogen. The goal here is to reduce cost and move this technology along so that we can be more efficient and cost effective in producing hydrogen. And some of the industry sponsors, AES, Air Liquide, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Mitsubishi, Ørsted, and Sempra. So this is a big announcement, obviously impacting the region here, and another example of some of the programs federally that are impacting us here in Texas. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Doug.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it. Lots of great information, and yeah, huge announcement with Houston getting the hydrogen hub just last Friday, right? I think was the announcement.
That's right.
All right. So I'll remind everybody, if you have questions either for me or Jack or Kate, please put them into the chat and we will get to those. We're going to go till just a little bit before 3:30 today, and we will leave some time for questions if y'all have them. I'm going to start with you, Kay, if that's okay. This session was, there's a lot of adjectives I could put in here, but let's say wild as far as renewable energy went. There were a lot of bills that were really meant to harm the industry. Can you talk about that? What were some of those bills? What happened? Did they pass? How is this significant for renewables? And yeah, why are we seeing that antagonism there? What's going on? And then Jack, if you want to jump in after Kay, feel free.
Yeah, I would say probably the most aggressive bill was the one related to permitting and siting, which would have required developers or generation owners to contact landowners within, I believe it was 25 miles of their location, which is, there's just really no way to rationalize, say on a solar farm, why somebody the next county over would have an interest. And one thing that was particularly disturbing was, as it was originally written, it applied to operating facilities as well as potentially new facilities. I actually wrote the sponsoring senator because I'm a constituent. Like I said, I own property and vote in Austin County, and asked, said, I'm not really crazy about this bill. They said, well, we want to protect wildlife and something else. I don't remember what it was. Didn't have anything to do with reliability. Didn't have anything to do with the grid. And there are rumors and speculations about what was behind it. But what was unusual, I would say, this session is that some of the bills just lacked. They just lacked a real principled reason beyond just being opposed to something. You were closer to the process, but the information I was getting is this wasn't really driven by this isn't oil companies saying go block renewables. That's not what was going on. Instead, what we've seen is the polarization and the political aspects being a bigger part of the energy conversation, which is obviously not particularly helpful for those of us who are consuming it. Both sides play into that dynamic, so it's not one is worse. But when it becomes a political issue, then sometimes it's not particularly logical. What the ultimate result was more middle of the road from the standpoint of actual legislation with, I think it was mentioned a minute ago, the legislation about the allocation of cost, changing how costs are allocated for transmission. And it doesn't specifically say, so this is going to be a real bummer for renewable energy, But before, where the costs were spread, having the generators pay for it, well, you generally aren't going to cite, although Houston has a lot of solar farms going close, close to Houston. A lot of renewable energy resources are farther out, so it would have a bit of a disparate impact, from that standpoint. But I think for me, what is the bigger issue is, and I don't remember if I mentioned this, but I work with Real Houston. That's my passion project. But I make my living advising investors in the energy space and serving on boards of companies in the space. And what's happening is it has a potential and actual chilling effect of future investment, because Texas is now being viewed as a state which presents political risk. And it's interesting, when the senator responded to me, she actually responded, there's been a lot of investment in renewable energy in Texas, so we don't want that to happen, and kept that email. And but if you want green hydrogen right now, everybody who's interested in the hydrogen economy are waiting to see how the rulemaking is going to come down and whether to qualify for the tax credits if you're going to have new renewable energy that is feeding your green hydrogen facility, or whether existing will count. We don't know the answer to that yet. But in any event, for our green hydrogen to really take off, you're going to have that renewable energy. So if Texas wants to be the center of all things green hydrogen, or all things hydrogen, blue and green, then it could also have a potential impact in that area.
Yeah, Jack, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I agree with a lot of what Kay said. I think, this is really, we've gotten into this situation where it's a food fight. I mean, it's picking one side over another. If you can't be in favor of renewables, if you're in favor of fossil, and it's kind of silly, right? I mean, it's not helpful. We're seeing it at the national level, and we're seeing it in state level. And it's hard. The energy companies themselves have made a lot of kind of amazing transitions over time, and are looking at opportunities to work in all of these spaces. And it's not, a lot of investment dollars are going into all this, and it's not helpful to have that kind of environment. And so it's, we talk about this all the time. Education, we need to be doing a better job of making policymakers and other influentials aware that we need it all, and we need to be looking at these things in terms of advancing technology and enabling different approaches, because we don't know what's going to work, right? It's going to be a combination of things, and and what works in one state may not work in another, or one region within a state may not work within another. So we have to be flexible about the way we approach this. So I would agree. I think it's been difficult because of this, some of the anti renewable rhetoric and activity out there, and we want to make sure we are taking advantage of the real opportunity that we have here in this area, where we're so equipped to deal with the energy transition.
If I can just add to what Jack said, some of us have been around the energy industry and the power industry in particular long enough to remember where, Texas ran with a 14% reserve margin. At this point, we're catching up to even being comfortable. So it's a particularly bad time to be discouraging, and agree completely with what Jack has said about, increasing, we got to increase base load, but we need to keep all the power we have and add more is where we are. And then let's continue the conversation and do some work on efficiency and demand response, et cetera. That all of the above needs to include efficiency, and most all of the aboves we don't.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's interesting. It's getting a lot of lip service, which is good. I shouldn't be so dismissive. It's good that it's in the discussion, but we also need to get to the point where there's an actual increase in energy efficiency rather than, I hear a lot more these days, we need to address the demand side, but then they don't actually address the demand side. I just want to add on just a couple things here before I ask a question of Jack, and then we can go to some audience questions. I see some coming in, and they're great. Keep them coming, please. So a couple things that y'all said, I just want to pick up on. Number one, I think it is particularly interesting to note that the oil and gas industry is not a monolith. A lot of folks think that this is some oil and gas versus renewables fight, and there certainly are some folks within the oil and gas world that don't like renewables. But I would say, and Jack and Kay, you all both have experience in the industry, so I'd love to hear your perspective on this. But we're actually seeing a lot of oil and gas companies purchase renewables because drilling for oil is a very energy intensive process. And when you look at where the Permian Basin is and where the Eagle Ford is, you have an abundance of wind and solar resources there. So that actually helps drive their cost down. So I think one of the interesting dynamics during the session was like a lot of the usual suspects who would have been against renewables in the past are kind of like, actually, this isn't really serving our interests. And even to take that a step further, the oil and gas companies seem to be looking for a lot more transmission to connect their projects, while some folks they're allied with on other issues are trying to add costs to renewables. So it makes your head hurt, all the different sort of weird, sort of bedfellows and alliances that are happening and where some folks are aligned on some things and not on others. And then, there's so many different directions to go from there. I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add to that, or we should move on to other things, but it's endlessly fascinating.
I mean, I can just add that, a little back a little bit of the word I got after the last legislative session where some of the worst stuff got pulled at the end is that it would be surprising to some people to hear who the voices were at the end who helped pull back some of the most aggressive provisions, and those voices just were coming out of Houston. So and so I think that I would say the last 4 years have really there has been a definite shift. And if you listen to how the majors talk now versus 4 years ago, I think it is a different world. And
things have changed so fast.
Things have changed. Things have changed faster than I would have expected them to change.
The one other point I'll make here, and then Jack, I want to get your thoughts on this if you have any more, we can move on. But I think it's really important also to note, and there was an interesting discussion about this at the ERCOT board meeting just this morning. There is a lot of solar and storage being added to the grid right now, and that does make a significant contribution to reliability. This summer, there were 10 different days when all-time records were set. And on each of those 10 days, solar contributed 12% minimum at peak. Storage really bailed us out on June 20th, September 6th, the number of days when we were very close to the edge, close to outages. And that's with only a few thousand megawatts. And as Jack pointed out, we're likely to be at 10,000 megawatts by the end of next year. Again, a lot of puzzle pieces. It is not to say that solar and storage solve every problem we have. Their contribution to reliability is going to be lower in the winter. It's not zero. We saw during Elliott, solar made a big contribution last December. It's not as much as it is during the summer. So not suggesting, and please don't have the takeaway be solar and storage solves all the problems, but they do contribute a lot to reliability. So Jack, if there's anything you want to add to this, or should I?
Well, I just totally agree with that. I mean, that's why I mentioned that new capacity, storage capacity coming online. And we need in the situation we're in right now, we need to be looking at everything, and that's why I think this approach, getting away from this being anti one thing or anti another is just a bad idea for the state of Texas. I saw somebody ask a question earlier. It came up in the chat about how do I say that we were lucky when we were paying so much for power. And that's a great point, but having power, I think, is the most important thing. The fact that we didn't have significant outages is the important thing. Lucky is a relative term. So I think that's kind of what I meant there.
Jack, I want to stay with you and ask you, and we'll do this before we get on to, I see some good questions coming in the chat, so we'll go there next. But I want to ask you a little bit about the energy transition and what it means for Texas. So there's a lot of challenges. You alluded to this a little bit in your remarks. There's sort of the perception from the outside of what's going on in Texas could be a little bit of a challenge. Can you talk about other challenges? But also, I want you to talk about sort of on the other side of the coin. What are some of these opportunities? What are the advantages Texas has, and what are the opportunities embedded in the energy transition for Texas?
Well, I like to look out the window of my office and look around and think to myself, wow, look at all of these amazing companies and institutions that are right here, in the Houston area, for instance, that are dead in the middle of the energy transition. And there are all kinds of different companies, right? Some of them are traditional oil and gas companies, service companies. Some of them are renewables. A lot of technology out there that are dealing with data, that are dealing with just so many different aspects of all of this, and everything from renewables to traditional energy that's to nuclear. The transition itself is important because it does it is there. It's a way for our existing industry that's been so important to the state to continue, and we know that we're going to need fossil energy for a long time, but it helps us decarbonize. And when you look at the globe and you look at where we are, it really is about competitiveness, right? I mean, if we're able to advance this technology here, that puts us ahead of the rest of the world. And I think it really comes down to that competitiveness. I mentioned earlier when the IRA passed and how a lot of countries in Europe are envious of the fact that we have this. Some of them were downright mad and wanted to take it to the WTO and trade violations. And there's been talking about that. Well, I mean, this is important investment, huge capital expenses, right? Massive amounts of money in order to get there. And it is money that, quite frankly, companies themselves, most of them can't shoulder that. So these are important investments that we're making into technological advancements and investments we're making in our future in terms of our competitiveness, future jobs, being a global leader and continuing to lead the world in a lot of different areas, everywhere from energy production and distribution to manufacturing, and being able to do that in a lower carbon world where you look at what's coming down the road, and when we're going to probably be assessed a fee for carbon content and starting to affect global trade. So I'll stop there, but that's my assessment of what it means.
And Kay, before we get your thoughts, I want to just throw just a couple of stats, a couple of numbers at y'all, and these come from the International Energy Agency roadmap to net zero report, where they show that over the last 8 years, investment globally in oil and gas has been roughly flat, slightly declining. We're not quite back. That this may be updated by the end of 2023, and we will be back to pre-pandemic levels, but roughly a flat line at about $1 trillion of global investment in oil and gas annually over the last 8 years. In that same time period, clean energy investment has gone from 1 trillion to about 1.8 trillion. And based on just the announced pledges of companies around the world and their pathway, their requirements, their own pledges at the Conference of Parties meetings. There's another one coming up in December where there'll be more pledges made. But just on the announced pledges, spending by 2030 would go from 1.8 trillion expected this year to about 3.5 trillion. So a doubling over the next 7 years, while oil and gas stays flat or declines somewhat. That's not to say that $1 trillion in oil and gas, that's still a lot of money, and a lot of that's coming to Texas. But this is the old, that sort of that saying, I like to use a lot, that when Wayne Gretzky was asked why he was so much better, he said, everybody else was skating where the puck was, and I skated to where the puck was going. The puck is going towards clean energy. And it's not to say that Texas isn't going to continue to invest in oil and gas. It's just we should be investing in clean energy because of these massive increases in investment that we're seeing. Kay, anything you want to add to this before we jump into some audience questions?
I'll say something, if I can be allowed to say something provocative. Maybe two things. First, I think at some point we're going to talk about gas and we're going to talk about oil, and we're not going to talk about oil and gas, because I think that the path forward for both of those is different. When we're just talking about oil, if you look at all of when you look at the credible assessments, the amount of current commercially available reserves, and you look and how long those would last if we keep producing and consuming at the same rate, and you look at the time frame that most oil companies say will take to get through the energy transition, they're about the same amount of time. One thing that the climate change conversation has done is taken depletion out of the conversation. And now, when you might have in the past be talking about investments and finding new ways to find that currently not economic oil, you're looking more at what are ways to invest in something that's going to meet the clean energy agenda. So I think we've, I mean, the smart people are saying oil prices are going to be a solid $80 for the next 4 years. So you may see some, production increases, but I mean, it sounds just about right? I mean, that's a pretty good number for most of the majors. So I'm not sure that really addressed that was intended to tie into your question about investment, because it would make more sense to invest in something with a longer horizon when there are other reasons to be going that direction anyway.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's jump into some audience questions. Thanks for putting them in the chat. I don't know that we'll have time to get to everything, but if you have additional questions, put them in there. I'll try to tie questions together where I can. And Jack, I think I'll start with you on this one, because I think you alluded to this in your slide. Someone had asked, why is insulation, they say of ERCOT, but I think they mean basically of power plants and oil and gas facilities, been ignored or downplayed. I'll start by saying it hasn't been completely ignored. I think everybody understands that weatherization needs to happen. But what is sort of the state of those efforts, if you could speak to that, Jack?
Well, I think, it makes a lot of sense to do that. I don't know that that there have been enough in the way of incentives. I've got to go back and look, because I'm not really aware of what the incentives, what some of those drivers are to doing that. Weatherization is as you mentioned earlier, just the whole insulation, energy efficiency, smart things that we can be doing for less money. We really need to be doing that. And I think a lot of it has to do with where are the drivers there, right? I mean, when you see a lot of big money aimed at building things, and you're going to chase that, and maybe there's not enough attention. It's not as glamorous either, right? I mean, there's that as well. But I think it really has to do more with where the attention's being focused, and public policy can move these things. And so, but I really don't know. I'd have to go take a look at what's if there are things in the IRA, for instance. I just don't know.
Yeah, so I'll just say real quick that there was in Senate Bill 3, which was passed in 2021, some requirements for weatherization. The Railroad Commission has stood up the Critical Infrastructure Division. Unfortunately, even after the weatherization inspections that both ERCOT and the Railroad Commission were in place, we had a test case with Winter Storm Elliott, which I don't think people are talking about nearly enough. It was really cold, but it was, in fact, ERCOT said today we've had 4 similar cold snaps to Elliott in the last, I think they said 11 years, might have been 12 years. So roughly once every 3rd year. And we saw a 30% drop in output of gas. We saw 120% increase in thermal power plant outages in a 12-hour period. We went from 6 gigawatts out to 14 gigawatts out, much less than the 30 gigawatts we lost during Uri, but still an alarming increase, particularly given there was no snow and ice associated with Storm Elliott. So still a long way to go. And I think, Gabriel, it's a really good question. And it's, one of the questions, had Pablo been moderator, he was going to ask me is, what are the actual solutions or changes to increase reliability and resilience? And I would say, I think energy efficiency is at the top of the list. And I think the basic blocking and tackling is getting the weatherization of natural gas supply and of power plants right. Kay, anything you want to add to that?
Nope. I'm gonna let,
cool.
yeah.
All right. So we've got a question about, this is an interesting one. Jack, you talked about sort of the need for baseload power and capacity payments. One of our commenters, Nat Treadway, talks about how that $5,000 per megawatt hour price is a really rich incentive. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, can that drive new investment? Does it not? What are your thoughts on his question there?
I think that what we've got right now is a situation that's not really driving investment, and we need to be creative about the way we do that, especially in a world where we're not, politically willing to do what is traditionally a capacity payment. So we need to come up with some solutions. You mentioned Berkshire Hathaway, the solution that they were looking at. Are there ways that we can incentivize more localized power sources? I think that, I think one of the questions is alluding to the fact that maybe this old model is something we need to get past, and we need to think about more distributed generation. And how do we incentivize distributed generation? I think there's a lot of opportunity for entities that aren't necessarily considered to be in the power business to become players in the power business, like industrial. I mentioned earlier the SMRs, right? But it could be other sources of power generation, cogeneration, things that can be utilized, or neighborhoods that decide that they want, or communities that want to have localized power sources that they use for themselves to kind of protect themselves. And this is happening. I know people that are doing this with geothermal, for instance, but also, be sources of extra generation, putting electrons out on the grid because they're producing, more than what their needs are. So I think that there are some ways to incentivize all of that beyond what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I definitely think distributed generation is going to be one of these mega trends. I think we're already seeing these just hockey stick curves, not only in utility scale solar and utility scale battery storage, but we're just at that inflection point where I think we're going to see a whole lot more distributed as well. I think that's a really good point. Kay, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, to my knowledge, most of the major players in renewable energy have set up distributed generation platforms that are important to them. And you're seeing that both in the US, and you're starting to see it, and you're seeing it also in Europe. So I agree that's anything that'll leaves pressure off the grid is good for all of us. And I think that's something that LSCs, load serving entities, or power companies are starting to realize is maybe not as bad as they thought it was.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if y'all don't mind me straining the metaphor I was using earlier with subtraction and all that, I mean, that's sort of a way to do subtraction by addition, if you will. In other words, when you're adding solar and storage, or even EVs, if they're connected to the home and able to power the home, and there's technical challenges associated with that, but not insurmountable ones, you're adding sources closer to where they're used that are actually going to appear to the grid as a reduction. So another place where subtraction can actually really make a big difference. There were some questions in here about, and I think we had some questions just as we were talking about IRA and what that means. I would just point out, I think this is not, I don't think this is widely understood enough, because there's a lot of, again, even obviously the ERCOT board meeting is kind of fresh on my mind because it just happened this morning, but they were railing against all the subsidization of wind and solar. One thing that the IRA did was it now provides the production tax credit for all sources of power if they're carbon free. So if you are gas with carbon capture, if you're nuclear, you are now eligible, right? Including existing nuclear are today getting the production tax credit, and all new nuclear will as well. So I think that is an underappreciated aspect of the IRA. I think this question about LNG is pretty interesting. I don't know, Kay and Jack, if you already read it, I guess just in case folks aren't in a place where they can read the chat. It's asking about, Gabriel is asking about the US LNG projects, and as LNG export capacity has gone up significantly in recent years, isn't that going to drive up the price of natural gas and maybe make it harder for blue hydrogen down the road? Kay, you talked about the difference between oil and gas, and we need to not keep saying oil and gas. These are very different commodities. Do you want to take that question first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, as I sort of mentioned earlier, nobody wants to export $2 gas, or they don't want the gas to be worth $2 when they export it. So that you would definitely expect to see upward pressure on US gas prices, potentially downward pressure to wherever we're exporting. But I think that's the reasonable expectation, that there'll be some movement. There are smart people who have projections on that, and I'm not going to misquote any projections, but yeah, I mean, supply and demand drive pricing, and as you create a larger global market for natural gas, we can expect that price pressure here in the U.S.
So I'll jump in. The war in Ukraine has had a major impact on our LNG markets, right? And you definitely see the U.S. LNG shipments chasing those dollars that are the higher prices that they're fetching in Europe right now. So that's an example of what Kay's talking about, is that we've seen this shift of in LNG shipments going to Europe. Whether that's going to take place long term or not is an interesting question. They don't want to pay for long term prices. They want more of a spot market situation. LNG companies, they want the certainty of longer term contracts, and over time, Asia is probably more likely to be paying for that because their growth is in the trajectory that it's on, and their decarbonization efforts are a lot different than Europe. So I think what we're going to see is a longer term movement of LNG shipments to Asia, and we'll still be supporting Europe, but the Europeans, at least what they're saying, I don't know if they'll be able to do it completely, is that they look at LNG as a temporary solution to their energy issues. For the United States, yeah, the question is, are we going to be investing the amount of money that we need in terms of long-term supply for natural gas? We've got a lot of going on right now. We've had we have a pretty good trajectory right now, but you looked a few years down the road and we've had an erosion of investment dollars in oil and gas in general. And so how does that impact our longer term ability to produce natural gas for LNG export and to be used in our processes and our economy as well? And
I think at $2 and $3 is not incentive pricing for investment and further exploration.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things, I think this is another underappreciated thing, is that as the prices overseas, during the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were looking at prices in Asia of like $40-50 and a BTU. I think it's somewhere in the $10 to $20 range now. Europe was like 20 to 30, and now that's down, but still a multiple of what's being paid here. I think as we get more and more LNG, you start to get more and more of a global price, like you do for oil, right? There's, yeah, sure, there's difference at different hubs, but it's within a band. There's basically a global price of oil. We might be headed that way for natural gas, which I think should probably be scary to consumers, and be more reason to have a bigger hedge against those high prices by having more renewables and energy efficiency and nuclear and all of those kinds of things.
Well, this year we had that first year where domestic natural gas prices were showing a bit of a correlation with global, not just internal macros, so, or internal fundamentals. So if that continues over a year, then I think we can safely say we definitely have seen a trend.
So I'm gonna respond. There was one other question I want to make sure we take here, which was about baseload power. And Jack, I think it was asked of you, so I'll give you a chance. But I'm gonna just respond to that, and then Jack, you can respond and also just kind of do some closing thoughts. And then Kay, if you can share some closing thoughts, and then we'll turn it back to Alan to end the webinar. But I think that this concept of so for those that aren't as familiar with the term baseload, that basically means a power plant that is going to run 24/7, like nuclear. There are other power plants that are designed to run that way, but these days there aren't that many coal plants or gas plants that actually run 24/7. They're moving up and down. I think that we are going to see a sea change in the electric industry as demand becomes more responsive when there are price signals, and those price signals need to be there. But we have seen with the onset of automated intelligence and machine learning, and just people getting more and more used to setting different programs and then not worrying about them in different aspects of their lives, I think we're going to see that move in more and more. And I think it's going to become not a nice to have and just something people are interested in, want to have because it's cool technology, but actually essential and foundational once electrification of transportation really reaches that tipping point. And I think we're reaching that tipping point in sales. But once you have whole streets that have one or even two electric vehicles, and they're going to need to be charged, when people get home from work at 5, 6, 7 o'clock and plug that in as the sun is going down, we're going to have major problems. And then the inverse is true. If they plug it in and there's a smart software connected to it that is automatically going to charge that car up overnight when there's plenty of power, then that is going to make the grid more reliable and even be able to power that home when there's scarcity during those hours. So I think there's going to continue to be some base load power, but I think the relevance of that kind of power will diminish as flexibility becomes more and more important. And even within the nuclear industry, which is sort of the quintessential base load, I was talking to somebody in one of these newer companies. I can't remember which one it was, but they were talking about how in their new plants, they're including molten salt. So basically it's going to act as a form of storage. So they can, even with nuclear, they're going to have the ability to move up and down what they're exporting to the grid. This is in my view, sort of again, where the puck is headed. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Jack and then Kay to bring us home, and then we'll turn it back over to Alan Dent.
Yeah, I would just say that I agree with what you're saying. Technology is moving us in a lot of different directions, and one of those directions is to have technology provide us with more localized sources of power. And the term base load, in terms of its traditional form, I think we aren't going to see the investments in those types of facilities in like we did in the past. Even when we look at nuclear, and we talk to a lot of people in the nuclear space, they're not considering building, at least in the United States, any more of the old, large, traditional power plants. They're looking at more of the SMR type models. Same thing with natural gas. I mean, I think we're looking at a lot of smaller distributed power type situations. And on renewables, being able to store power and be able to be dispatchable. All of those things are changing sort of the roadmap that we're looking at, and it's all technologically driven. It's all investment driven, and we need to keep those dollars moving into those types of solutions. And then we need to be sure that we're supporting the infrastructure that's going to enable us to dispatch that power and to and to have reliable, safe future sources of power generation and distribution. So I think all of those things are very important. They take investment, and they take sound public policy. And what we all need to be doing, because we are in the industry, and either in the energy industry, or we're in industries that are where energy efficiency is important, we need to be letting our public policymakers know that all these things are important to us, and that we need to be really smart about the way we're writing public policy and investing our dollars.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kay.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Jack said. I mean, we're at a critical point in capital allocation in the energy industry. You talked about trillions of dollars in investments, billions of dollars in incentives, and Texas, it would be great to see Texas open for business, fully open for business in the energy industry, and open for all different kinds of energy, and truly be the capital and on the front end of whatever's coming next in the energy industry. If we don't, then we're looking at a situation I don't think any of us want to really envision. If anybody thinks the status quo has never been available in energy, because energy has always been a transitioning industry. And we can see now where dollars are and where they want to go. And we need to encourage our policymakers to take positions that encourage as much of that as possible to come to Texas, because I'm a 5th generation Texan, so I'm completely biased on this. But Texas should be leading not just the United States, but truly the world in energy, both in innovation and implementation. And we're all we need to do is quiet the noise and focus on what Texans do best, which is get things done, and less chatter about the political side of it.
Thanks so much, Kay and Jack. You guys are both great. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks to the audience for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Alan to make a couple announcements before we end. Thanks, Alan. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Doug and Jack and Kay. That was an incredible conversation. And my apologies to those of you who did not have your questions directly addressed. There was just so much there that we couldn't get to everything. And I'm afraid for now that is just where we're at. But wonderful discussion, wonderful input from all of you. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your questions too. I think, Gary, can you go back one slide? Gary, there you go, yes. So just 2 things to wrap up with. First of all, TIEEN has a sister organization called TEEP, which is the Texas Industrial Energy Efficiency Program. This mostly deals with chemicals, petrochemicals, oil refining sector. But we do have a fall energy forum for the TEEP organization, and so have this in the chat. But this will be energy efficiency and decarbonation success stories. And the date is Wednesday, November 29th. Between 1 and 4:30 p.m. And this will be an in-person event, and it will be staged with the ChemE show at Moody Gardens in Galveston. And I put the registration link in the chat for anyone who's interested in that. So Gary, your next slide. So 2 other logistical items, I guess you could say, or housekeeping items. Those of you who are interested in getting PDH certificates, there is a link here, and I'm also putting that in the chat for you. If you follow that link, it will take you to an automated system that will allow you to request PDH certificates. And then the other point, there is a survey. We'd very much like to get your feedback. You don't have to read that off the screen and type it into your into your browser, because again, that is in the chat as well. So please, if you would, just so we get feedback on how this went, what you liked, what you think can be improved, all of those things that will help us pursue continuous improvement with our programs. We would appreciate it if you'd complete the survey. And that just brings us to the end of this webinar. And hey, well done, Doug. You brought us in right on time. So it's right at 3:30. But thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for sharing this big chunk of your afternoon with us, and hope to see you again at our future events. Thanks everyone, and goodbye to you.